Nick Loris is an economist who focuses on energy, environmental, and regulatory issues as the deputy director of the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy and Studies, and a Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Nick, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
This piece is terrific. It's over at the Daily Signal. Our friends at the Daily Signal do terrific work. They're a branch of the Heritage Foundation. On Earth Day, gloomy predictions haven't come to pass. Could you walk us through a few of the left's more macabre predictions about global climate change that haven't actually happened yet?
Yeah, there's a whole laundry list of them dating back to the first Earth Day 49 years ago. There was talks of imminent resource exhaustion, that we were going to run out of coal, oil, natural gas, that we were going to be starving, and that the growing population wouldn't be able to keep up with the food supply that we need. And if you look at what's actually happened, not only are we now the world's largest oil and gas producer and have abundant resources well into the future because of human ingenuity and entrepreneurial passion, we also are seeing measurable increases in emissions reductions, in improvements in water quality, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So we are meeting our energy needs and improving our environment at the same time.
So I grew up in the 90s, and we were basically raised to believe that chlorofluorocarbons and the hole in the ozone were going to lead to all life on Earth baking off the planet by the year 2000, which seemed a long way away, even though it was like 3 years away at the time. Of course, none of that stuff comes to pass. What I'm interested in is, why is the left so invested in telling us that the planet's going to end, that life on the planet is going to end? Do they believe it?
I think it's a combination of two things. One is partly some believe it. I objectively think that some believe that that's true. But two is just these fear-mongering narratives sell. And when you're trying to sell public policy that expands the control of the government and gets you where you want to be in terms of subsidizing renewable sources or having command and control styles of regulation for reducing CO2 emissions or a carbon tax, cap and trade, you name it, it's these fear-mongering narratives that sell. And then when they don't come true, like when Al Gore predicted that the polar ice caps would be ice-free by now, in fact, 4 years ago by now, no one really takes them to task on why they were wrong, yet we're stuck with the bad policies.
Yeah, the bad ideas don't seem to go away. And one of the things that concerns me about all the fear-mongering, you may be right, and that most of the people who, at least most of the politicians on the left, may not be true believers, although some certainly are. But over time, don't they all become true believers? I think about when I was a kid, I was sort of fascinated by the idea of nuclear weapons. And you would hear people say all the time, we have the technology to wipe out life on Earth dozens of times over. And today, you'll hear actual people working in the Defense Department say things like that, even though it's obviously absurd. I mean, nuclear weapons, terrible, the most terrible power ever sort of unleashed by man. But the idea that we could eradicate life on Earth many times over is obviously farcical. Isn't it the same with this sort of climate change fear-mongering, where it may all start as rhetoric in service of a political goal, but over time, the language sort of becomes ubiquitous and everyone sort of slouches into a general acceptance of it?
Yeah, that's right. I think it starts out as a game of telephone where one report will say something that doesn't sound all that scary. And then, by the time that the media gets a hold of it and politicians start talking about it, it becomes these worst case scenarios, and they sound like they're very high risk, even though they're low probability or even borderline impossible to happen, like these extreme catastrophic climate scenarios. And then that's where you get policy resolutions like the Green New Deal to address something like this. And then a lot of the times the cure is much worse than the disease when you're talking about climate policies, especially thinking of all of the energy price increases that households and businesses would incur. And because energy is such a critical component of everything we make and everything we do, you're not just paying when your electricity bill comes and when you pay at the pump, but for all the goods and services you buy. And so it has these huge cascading negative effects throughout the economy. And for no negligible climate benefit. And I think that's the real kicker here, is that these policy prescriptions would actually do nothing to mitigate global warming, even if we were headed towards these catastrophic scenarios, which we're not.
That's the Bjorn Lomborg point of view, right? That he was saying a decade ago that if we did everything that the Kyoto protocols recommended we would forestall global warming by something like 5 years. What's the reality today? If we were to fully implement the Green New Deal, if we got rid of cow farts and we let the government raise our kids and we give free health care to everybody in the country because somehow that has to do with the climate, but no changes are made in India, no changes are made in China, no changes are made around the developing world. But by the actual science being cited by the alarmists, what kind of good does it actually do us?
Yeah, not much. Barely a change in the Earth's temperature that's practically immeasurable. And these are based on climate models that were developed in part by the government and with funding from the Environmental Protection Agency. It says that even if we were to reduce our emissions down to zero, we would only avert global warming by a few hundredths of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century, maybe a few tenths of a degree if we were lucky and everything fell into place. And even if we got cuts from the rest of the developed world, then you're talking about maybe 3 or 4 tenths of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century. John Kerry, Secretary of State Kerry, even said as much when he was negotiating the Paris Climate Accord, saying that even if the developed world does it all, with the developing world needing more access to affordable, reliable energy and using a lot more coal, we're never going to meet any type of temperature reduction targets, and nor should we, and nor should the developing world commit to lower standards of living.
Shouldn't we want the developing world to develop, to have more access to energy to power their ascent?
That's right. Yeah, and if you look at the countries who are taking care of their environment, it's the ones that have the wealth and the means to do so, and affordable energy is a critical component of that. The reason that the United States has such high air quality and water quality and we've reduced our emissions isn't because of regulation, because we have the resources and the wealth to do so, and because we have economic freedom and strong, well-enforced private property rights. And that's what we should be aspiring for other countries, is to get that better standard of living, get higher levels of prosperity so they have the resources to clean up their air quality and clean up their drinkable water sources.
Yeah, the worship of poverty is one of the most unflattering impulses of the left. I remember in 2009, I visited the African nation of Djibouti, where America has a military presence and there's a strong history of French involvement in the country. And once we got off the base, we went for a drive for miles and miles and dozens of miles. There was nothing but trash as far as you could see from horizon to horizon. I'd never experienced anything in it. It was as though the entire countryside were a landfill. And I suppose that there are two ways that you could respond to seeing that kind of destruction of the environment and the kind of poverty of the people who live amidst that trash, who burn that trash to keep warm at night. You can either feel guilt or you can feel outrage at the policies that have led people to live in those sorts of ways when freedom, an embrace of freedom, could lead them to such a better life, and more outrage toward a left that actually seems to want to keep them stuck in that state and wants to say that this country is the great polluter, that this is the place that's destroying the earth. It's really a pretty unbelievable position they've carved out.
Yeah, it is. And on top of that, then you have virtue signaling policies like banning plastic straws that are only, 0.2% of the global ocean plastics problem, but it makes people feel good about themselves. Meanwhile, we're doing nothing to helping these countries get better standards of living so they can take care of their environment and reduce those ocean plastics that are largely coming from Asian countries. And we can actually solve two problems, which is addressing global poverty and energy poverty, while at the same time cleaning up the environment. But that's not really where the left wants to go.
So before we let you go, what's the good news? What's happening on the global stage in regard to these issues that gives you cause to celebrate?
Yeah, I think if you look objectively at the statistics in terms of the emissions that we know have adverse impacts on human health and the environment, they've dropped significantly over the past 30 years, and they were dropping before we enacted the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. And, the entrepreneurial spirit and technological innovation that allows us to use energy and use energy more efficiently, that improves the environment and saves people money. These things are all real high quality stuff that's leading to these better standards of living. So I think if you look at every measurable statistic, whether it is criterion pollutants or global hunger or energy poverty, all of those signals are going in the right direction. And we know the reasons why, and that is economic freedom. And the more we can export freedom and private property rights to the rest of the world, the better the planet's going to be.